God killed two priests on the same day, on the same battlefield. For a reason the Hebrew text records without any softening. They were the sons of the high priest of Israel, and they were sleeping with women at the entrance of the tabernacle. But that was not the only reason. Before the Philistines ran them through with their swords, before the Ark of the Covenant was captured, before the glory of Israel left forever, there were years of a system of corruption that their father saw without lifting a finger. And when God finally spoke, he did not send a prophet with a second chance. He sent a man to announce the exact date of their death, the method, and a name that would be born that same day, to leave engraved upon a newborn child what really happened that day in Shiloh. Today I am going to tell you everything, layer by layer, sin by sin, until we reach the most terrifying sentence that God ever pronounced over two men in the entire Old Testament. That sentence is this: they did not listen to the voice of their father because the Lord desired to put them to death. That sentence does not exist by accident. That sentence is there because it describes a theological point of no return, a moment when God decides that two men no longer deserve to live. And the book of 1 Samuel dedicates 2 entire chapters to explaining how one arrives at that point. Let us enter together. Shiloh, 11th century before Christ. Approximately 1,100 years before the birth of Jesus, the tabernacle that Moses had been commanded to build in the wilderness had already been more than 300 years in the land of Canaan. After the conquest of Joshua, the sacred tent was established on a small, silent hill, surrounded by olive groves in the territory of the tribe of Ephraim. Shiloh means, in Hebrew, rest or tranquility. And for generations that is exactly what it was. The place where Israel went up 3 times a year to worship, to offer sacrifices, to hear the law. It was the spiritual heart of the people, and in that heart 2 priests were rotting it from the inside, Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli. The name Hophni possibly comes from a root meaning fist or strong one. Phinehas is an Egyptian name, the dark-skinned one, the same name carried by a hero of the generation of Moses. That Phinehas, grandson of Aaron, who stopped a plague with a spear in the wilderness, running through a rebel prince and a Midianite woman with a single thrust of holy justice. But this Phinehas, the son of Eli, was no hero of anything. The 2 brothers had inherited the priesthood through the bloodline, not through holiness. And the biblical text tells you so in the very first line, with a brutality that leaves no room for interpretation. Look how the account opens in 1 Samuel 2:12. In Hebrew, Uvene Eli b'nei Vlial, lo yad'u et yechwach. And in English, now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial, they did not know the Lord. Stop on the word Belial. In ancient Hebrew, Belial literally means worthless, destructive, corrupt to the bone. It was the heaviest term the language had to describe a human being. When the text calls someone a son of Belial, it is not insulting, it is classifying. It is saying, this man belongs to the category of those who destroy from within everything they touch. It is the same term that would later be used to designate the Antichrist in Jewish apocalyptic literature. It is the darkest term ancient Hebrew could produce, and it is applied without any euphemism to 2 men dressed in the sacred linen of the priesthood. And here is where the first layer of the abyss begins to open. Because these sons of Belial were not common criminals. They were ordained priests. They wore the sacred linen, they entered the holy place, they blessed the people in the name of the God of Abraham. And at the same time, in the same week, in the same building, they robbed the offerings, humiliated the worshippers, and slept with women at the entrance of the sanctuary. Picture the scene of the robbery. An Israelite man comes up from Bethel or from Gibeah. He has walked for days with an animal he himself raised, perhaps a lamb without blemish, perhaps a young bull. That animal represents months of work. That animal represents, for the family of the Israelite, real money. And more than money, it represents an offering, something the man wants to give to God in gratitude or in repentance. Perhaps a son has been born. Perhaps a harvest has been good. Perhaps a sin weighs upon his conscience. Whatever it is, that animal is his act of devotion. The man arrives at the sanctuary. He hands the animal to the priest. They sacrifice it. The law of Leviticus was clear on this point, crystal clear. The fat of the animal was burned first to the Lord. Afterward, the priest received the breast and the right thigh as his portion, after God. Never before, but Hophni and Phinehas had invented a new system. While the meat was still cooking in the pots, even before the fat had been burned to God, they would send a servant with a very specific instrument, a three-pronged fork. They would thrust it into the pot, and whatever came out hooked on it was theirs, whatever came out first, whatever belonged to God. Do you grasp the gesture? It is a total inversion of the sacred order. In Levitical sacrifice, God eats first, always. It is the foundational rule of the entire liturgy of the Old Testament. God receives his portion of fire. God receives the ascending smoke. God receives the fat. And only afterward do men eat. Hophni and Phinehas changed that order, themselves first, God afterward, and only if there was anything left. But something worse was waiting. If the worshipper dared to protest, if the poor man said, "First burn the fat to the Lord, and afterward take whatever you want," the response of the servant was brutal. The servant would say, "No, give it to me right now. If you do not give it to me, I will take it from you by force." By force. Inside the sanctuary of God, to a man who had traveled for days to worship. Picture the humiliation. Picture walking back to your village, telling your wife that the priests of the Lord stole the offering from you before you could even hand it to God. Picture how the faith of an entire people begins to erode when this is repeated, week after week, year after year, festival after festival. The text says it explicitly. The sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men despised the offering of the Lord. There is the consequence. There is the damage that God records. It is not just that the priests were stealing, it is that the people, the entire people, were beginning to despise the entire sacred system. They stopped wanting to bring offerings. They stopped wanting to go up to Shiloh. They stopped trusting that God was receiving their offerings. Hophni and Phinehas were not just stealing meat, they were stealing the faith of an entire generation, an Israelite who goes up every year to Shiloh, who brings his best ox, who sees the priests grow rich on what he sacrifices, who sees the smoke of the sacrifice rise with less intensity because the fat is no longer burned first, who returns to his village with a shrunken heart and a new thought. God is not here. That thought, multiplied by thousands of families, turns an entire nation into a spiritually orphaned people, without confidence in their priesthood, without respect for their sanctuary, without hunger for their God. And we still have not arrived at the worst, because corruption in the priesthood never stays in only one area, never. When a man allows himself to steal what is sacred, he also allows himself to profane what is sacred, and what follows in the account is one of the darkest scenes in the entire Old Testament. Eli was already very old at this moment. The text says he had heard everything his sons were doing to all Israel, everything. He was not a blind father, he was not an ignorant father, he knew perfectly. And what he had heard, what all Israel was talking about, was this, and how they lay with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Stop, breathe, and read that sentence again, because the Hebrew language here leaves no ambiguity. The verb is shakav, the same verb the book of Leviticus uses to describe forbidden sexual relations. It is not a metaphor. It is not figurative language. It is the technical term in ancient Hebrew for the sexual act. And the women mentioned were not just any women. They were the women who tsavu, who formed an organized body of service at the entrance of the sanctuary. To understand the weight of this, you need to know the following. The tabernacle had, since the days of Moses, women dedicated to liturgical service. Women who helped with cleaning, with the preparation of certain elements, with specific tasks of worship. Exodus mentions them for the first time when the bronze laver was made with the mirrors of the women who gathered at the entrance. They were consecrated women, dedicated women, women who had access to a sacred space because they served God in specific functions. Some were young widows without family, some were childless women who had made vows. All had one thing in common. They had given over a part of their lives to the sanctuary, and Hophni and Phinehas were violating them, seducing them, abusing them, sleeping with them only meters away from where the sacrifices were offered. Some modern scholars, like the biblical researcher Kyle McCarter in his commentary on 1 Samuel in the Anchor Bible series, point out something chilling. This conduct imitated the practices of the Canaanite fertility cults. In the pagan temples of Baal and Asherah, ritual sex was part of the worship. Temple priestesses would lie with worshippers as a religious act. Israel had been called to destroy that practice completely. The God of Israel was a God who rejected any mixture of sexuality with worship. And now, the very priests of the only true God were replicating inside the tabernacle exactly what God had commanded to be exterminated. They were turning the sanctuary into a Canaanite temple, and they were not doing it once. They were not doing it in secret. They were doing it systematically, in full view of everyone, with such frequency that all Israel knew about it and was talking about it. The text says that Eli heard everything that his sons were doing, everything. The Hebrew word here is not passive, it is continuous. Eli kept hearing and hearing and kept hearing. Year after year, he received reports. He probably received formal complaints from enraged husbands whose servant wives had been seduced. He probably saw with his own eyes, though his eyes were already growing weak, his 2 sons leaving the sanctuary at dawn with other women, and he kept doing nothing. And what did the father do when he finally spoke? Here, another layer opens. Finally, late. When the damage had already been done to an entire generation, Eli summons them, and he speaks to them. Look at how he does it. Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all this people. Do you see it? Even at the moment of confrontation, Eli does not say, I have seen. He says, I hear. He distances himself. He protects himself, as if the people were the accuser and he merely an intermediary. And then he pleads with them, with a strangely weak formulation for someone who is high priest and father. Do not so, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear. No good report. 2 priests are robbing the offerings of God, raping consecrated women, destroying the faith of an entire nation, and the father tells them it is no good report. As if the problem were public perception, as if it could be fixed with better marketing, as if sin were a matter of public relations and not of sacred violation. Compare that response with what the Mosaic law required. A rebellious son, according to Deuteronomy, was to be brought by his parents to the elders of the city to be judged and stoned. Eli, as high priest, had authority over the entire priesthood. He could have removed Hophni and Phinehas. He could have declared them unworthy. He could have brought in other priests to replace them. He could have even in Israelite jurisprudence presented them before the council of elders for capital judgment for profaning the sanctuary. He did none of that. He asked them gently to take care of their reputation. Here is where the biblical text strikes you with one of the most theologically heavy sentences in the entire Old Testament. It says it in Hebrew like this, Unkitchafetz yhwh lahamitam, and the exact translation is, because the Lord desired to put them to death. God desired. God wanted. God had reached the point where the decision was already made in heaven, and the deafness of Hophni and Phinehas to the voice of their father was not an accident. It was the visible manifestation of a divine sentence that had already been pronounced in silence. Do you understand the weight of that? There is a moment in God's dealings with certain men when divine patience exhausts all of its instances. It is not that God wants to kill just anyone. It is not that God is capricious. It is that there is a threshold, a specific threshold of continued rebellion, after which grace withdraws and only judgment remains. Hophni and Phinehas had crossed that threshold a long time ago. The silence of God during the years was not approval. It was contained wrath. Think of it this way. When a father lets his children commit a certain sin without correction, the child interprets the silence of the father as permission. When God lets a corrupt priest minister without immediate punishment, the priest interprets the silence as blessing. But it is neither of those two things. It is patience, and patience has a limit. And now wrath was about to speak. A character enters the scene who appears only once in the entire Bible. A man without a name. The text simply calls him Ish Elohim, a man of God. He arrives at the house of Eli. No one announces him. He brings no letter of recommendation. He just appears with a specific word from the Lord, and what he says is going to mark the destiny of an entire priestly family. His message has several parts. First, God remembers the covenant. He says to Eli, "Did I not clearly reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt in the house of Pharaoh? I chose your house from among all the tribes of Israel to be my priests." There is a tone of divine pain here. It is not just wrath. It is wrath mixed with betrayal. I chose you, I brought you out, I honored you, and you respond to me like this. Then comes the direct accusation. "Why have you honored your sons more than me, fattening yourselves on the choicest of every offering of my people Israel?" Fattening, the Hebrew word is lehavriakem, to fatten yourselves. God compares Hophni and Phinehas to fattening livestock. They had fed for years on what belonged to the altar. They had grown thick on the stolen offerings, and Eli, instead of stopping it, had protected them. And then the sentence comes. Pay close attention, because it has 4 parts, and each one will be fulfilled literally in the chapters that follow. First part, "Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. The house of Eli will have no elders. The men of that line will die young, generation after generation." Second part, "There will not be an old man in your house forever." The priesthood will leave this family. The line of Ithamar, to which Eli belonged, will lose the high priesthood. And indeed, generations later, under King Solomon, the high priest Abiathar, a direct descendant of Eli, would be deposed and expelled, definitively transferring the high priesthood to the line of Zadok, descendant of Eleazar. The biblical text explicitly records the fulfillment of this prophecy during the reign of Solomon. 150 years later, a sentence pronounced by an unnamed prophet would be fulfilled in every word. Third part, "And this shall be the sign to you, what shall come upon your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Both of them shall die on the same day." On the same day. That is the signature of God on the prophecy. That is the proof Eli is going to receive that all the rest will also be fulfilled. Not one, not with a year between them. The 2, the same day, in the same event, a mathematical precision that only God can guarantee. And when that precision is fulfilled, and Eli sees it fulfilled, the old man will understand that all the other parts of the prophecy will also be fulfilled. The destiny of the entire house is sealed. And the fourth part, and here is where the broader horizon of the entire history of redemption begins to open. "And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to my heart and my soul. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before my anointed forever. A faithful priest. That promise points in the short term to Samuel, the boy who at that very moment was growing up in the tabernacle under the tutelage of Eli himself, and who would soon receive the first prophetic revelation of his life. But it points also, in the long term, to something much greater. It points to Zadok, who would be the faithful high priest in the days of Solomon. And it points, in a horizon still further away, to the perfect high priest, the one whom the letter to the Hebrews identifies as Jesus, priest according to the order of Melchizedek, eternal, sinless, without succession. The contrast could not be more brutal. Hophni and Phinehas represent everything that the corrupt priesthood can be. Christ represents everything that the faithful priesthood is called to be. But let us stay in Shiloh still, because the prophecy is pronounced but not fulfilled. And what is going to happen now, in the months that follow, is one of the most agonizing narrative sequences in the entire Bible. God sends a second warning, this time through a child, Samuel, who at that moment was probably about 12 years old. According to the tradition preserved by the historian Flavius Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, is sleeping in the tabernacle. The text tells us something important, something often overlooked. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. Shiloh was in spiritual drought. God had stopped speaking. The prophets were silent. The heavens were closed. And suddenly, a voice. Samuel, Samuel. The boy gets up, runs to Eli and says, "Here I am, for you called me." But Eli had not called him. It happens 3 times, until the old man understands. It is God. It is God speaking to a child in the same house where his own sons could hear nothing because they had already been sentenced to death. There is a terrible contrast here. The orphan boy, for Samuel had been given to the sanctuary by his mother Hannah, hears the voice of God. The ordained priests, sons of the high priest, hear nothing because God no longer speaks to them. That is the first sign of spiritual judgment. When God decides to destroy a corrupt ministry, he first removes the prophetic voice. He first goes silent with the men in office, and he begins to speak to children, to humble women, to shepherds, to fishermen, to those nobody would expect. That happened in Shiloh. That happened in Nazareth. That happened in Galilee. God always bypasses the corrupt and seeks out the humble. And what God says to Samuel that night is all about the house of Eli. "Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle." Both ears. The Hebrew expression is titzalna shtei oznav, a paralyzing ringing. What God is about to do will be so terrible that when the people hear it, their ears will physically ring, like an explosion. Like a bell next to the ear, like the sound that remains after a trauma that leaves you breathless. And then God repeats the sentence, but this time with an additional declaration that should freeze your blood. "Therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of the house of Eli shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." Never, not by sacrifice, not by offering. The entire Levitical system had as its purpose to provide forgiveness through sacrifice. If you sinned, you brought a lamb. If you sinned more gravely, you brought a bull. There was a sacrifice for almost every imaginable sin. But God tells Samuel that for the sins of the house of Eli, the system will not work. No sacrifice will reach. No offering can cover. They have passed the point at which liturgical forgiveness has effect. What awaits them is direct judgment. Samuel in the morning does not want to tell Eli the vision. He is afraid. Picture the boy, 12 years old, raised by the old man, seeing in him a substitute father, having to tell him that his entire family has been condemned. But the old man presses him, "My son, do not hide it from me." And Samuel tells him everything, everything, the confirmation of the prophecy of the man of God. The irrevocable sentence, the promise of imminent judgment. And how does Eli respond? Here comes one of the most terrible sentences in the entire Old Testament in its resignation. The old man, high priest, father of 2 condemned men, simply says, "It is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him." Without struggle, without explicit repentance, without intercession, without tearing his garments, without fasting, without seeking to stop the judgment, he just accepts, Yahweh, it is the Lord. Let him do what he wills. Compare it with Moses, when God threatened to destroy Israel in the wilderness. Moses fell on his face for 40 days. He fasted, he pleaded, he interceded until God changed his decision. Compare it with David when his son born of Bathsheba was dying. David fasted on the ground. He pleaded for 7 days. He only accepted the death after the child had died. Compare it with Hezekiah when Isaiah announced his death. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and wept with great weeping, and God added 15 more years to him. Eli did none of those things, and that passivity is, in itself, part of the sin that condemned him along with his sons. Because look carefully at what God had said to the man of God. The full accusation was this: "Why have you honored your sons more than me?" Eli had chosen. At some point in his life, the old man had made a silent decision between correcting Hophni and Phinehas, even if it hurt, even if it removed them from the priesthood, even if it expelled them, and protecting his family position. Eli had chosen the second option. His silence was not neutrality, it was complicity. And in the economy of God, the priest who covers the sin of other priests shares in their judgment. Months pass. Life in Shiloh goes on apparently normally. Hophni and Phinehas continue ministering, continue sinning, continue, probably, mocking the announcement they had received. Because when a prophet announces judgment and the judgment does not fall immediately, the corrupt interpret the delay as approval. Ecclesiastes says it with surgical precision. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. But the time of God is not the time of men. And then the war comes. The Philistines, that sea people, probable descendants of the Aegean peoples who had migrated to the Canaanite coast, are in conflict with Israel. The Philistines were technologically superior. They dominated the work of iron. They had armor, long swords, chariots. The Israelites fought with more rudimentary weapons of bronze and stone. And yet when God was with Israel, Israel would win. During the generations of the judges, every time Israel repented and cried out to the Lord, God would raise up a deliverer. Othniel, Deborah, Gideon, Samson, and Israel would defeat superior enemies with inferior forces. It was the pattern of the covenant. But now God was not with Israel. The two nations face each other at a place called Aphek, identified today with Tel Aphek, at the site where the springs of the Yarkon River are born, about 12 kilometers east of the present-day city of Tel Aviv. The place had been a strategic crossroads for thousands of years. The Philistines' camp at Aphek, the Israelites' camp at Ebenezer, the Stone of Help, a few kilometers to the east, identified by most archaeologists with the site known today as Isbet Sarta, an ironic name, that of Ebenezer, for what was about to happen. First battle, the Philistines crush Israel. About 4,000 soldiers fall. The elders of Israel return to camp and have a crisis meeting. And here is where they make a decision that changes the history of the world. Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. The ark of the covenant, the chest of acacia wood covered in pure gold, the place where the visible glory of God rested, the Shekinah, between the two cherubim of beaten gold, the most sacred object that had ever existed on earth. The ark that had opened the Jordan, brought down the walls of Jericho, sent tumors upon the Philistines when they captured it years later in the story that is about to be told. But the elders of Israel did not want it for holiness. They wanted it as an amulet. That is the critical theological distinction. Israel had decided to use the ark as a magical talisman, as if the object by itself could force God to fight for them, as if it did not matter the spiritual state of the people, nor the corruption of the priests, nor the accumulated sins. Let us bring the ark. God has to defend his ark. God has to fight for us. It is a paganized theology. It is exactly how the Philistines thought about their own gods, as forces manageable through ritual objects. And the most terrifying thing is that Israel at that moment was thinking just like its enemies. That is always the clearest symptom of spiritual collapse, when the people of God begin to think like the pagans, when they begin to use the sacred as a tool, when they confuse the presence of God with the power of an object. And that same error, that same magical theology, runs through centuries. It appears in every age in which churches and religious people treat relics as amulets, crucifixes as shields, oils as formulas. The ark was real. The Shekinah was real. But God cannot be manipulated by the very object he himself commanded to be built. God responds to the obedience of the covenant, not to the physical movement of the chest. The ark travels from Shiloh to the battlefield, and in the procession go two priests, Hophni and Phinehas, the same sons of Belial, the same ones who had robbed the offerings, the same ones who had slept with the women of the sanctuary, the same ones condemned by God to die on the same day. They accompany the ark as officiating priests. The prophecy is about to be executed. When the ark arrives at the Israelite camp, the reaction is one of delirious euphoria. The text says that all Israel shouted with so great a shout that the earth trembled. A multitude of tens of thousands of men roaring at the same time, confident, euphoric, convinced that now they were going to crush the Philistines. The Philistines, in their own camp, hear the shout. They send out scouts, and when they find out that the ark has arrived, they fall into panic. Listen to how the Philistines react. The gods have come into the camp. Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. And they continue, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. It is striking. The pagan Philistines know the story of the Exodus better than Israel itself at that moment. They know that this God is the one who destroyed Pharaoh. They are afraid. But then their captains do something remarkable. They do not flee. They decide to fight all the same. And they decide to fight with extreme determination, knowing that if they do not win now, they will be slaves to the Hebrews forever. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. What happens next is one of the greatest military catastrophes in the entire Old Testament. So the Philistines fought and Israel was defeated. The Hebrew word is vainajef, from a root that means to be struck, to be beaten down. Israel does not retreat. Israel does not regroup. Israel is crushed. 30,000 Israelite soldiers fall dead in a single day. 30,000, so that you understand the scale. Because numbers written in full lose weight when you read them quickly. I want you to pause for a second. 30,000. Picture Wembley Stadium full. Picture that entire crowd. Picture that each one of those men is a corpse in a field. That is the magnitude of the judgment that fell that day on Israel. It was the worst military defeat in the history of the people up to that point. And in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the slaughter, someone approaches the ark. The Philistines surround it. Hophni and Phinehas, who had gone up as guardians, try to defend it, but they cannot. The text, with brutal economy, simply records, "And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died." The prophecy was fulfilled literally. On the same day, in the same field, in the same event, two corrupt priests, sons of Belial, who had spent years profaning the sanctuary, died beneath the Philistine sword while trying to protect the most sacred object that they had despised with their own lives. The punishment had a perfect irony. God did not kill them with fire from heaven, because that would have left their death as an isolated supernatural event. God killed them through a pagan enemy in the context of a national defeat, so that the entire house of Israel would understand that what had fallen that day was greater than two men. What had fallen was an entire priesthood, a corrupt system, a cursed family, and something even greater. Because the ark of God, was captured by the Philistines. Pause on that. The object that physically represented the presence of God on earth, the place where the Shekinah rested, was now in pagan hands. It was going to be carried to the temples of Dagon in Ashdod. It was going to be displayed as a trophy of war. For the first time since the days of Moses, the Ark of the Covenant was outside the Israelite camp, and not by the hands of priests carrying it in ritual procession, but by the hands of enemy soldiers carrying it as plunder. It was the unthinkable, an event that no Israelite of the previous generations would have imagined possible. The Ark was invulnerable. The Ark was inviolable. The Ark was the physical point where heaven and earth met. And now the Ark was being carried by men who had never been circumcised, by men who worshipped fish-shaped deities, by men who were about to place it next to the idol of their god Dagon, a decision that would cost them plagues and tumors over the 7 months that followed. But that is another story. But there was still one final scene. The scene that closes the entire account, and that introduces one of the saddest Hebrew words in the entire Bible. A man, a surviving soldier from the tribe of Benjamin, sets out running from the battlefield. The distance ahead of him is brutal. 42 kilometers from Ebenezer to Shiloh, almost all of it uphill, from the coastal plain up to the hills of Ephraim. It is exactly the distance of a modern Olympic marathon, and in fact, in Israel today, the Bible Marathon is run every year along that same route to commemorate this episode. The soldier runs with his clothes torn and dirt on his head, signs of extreme mourning in ancient Hebrew culture. He arrives exhausted. He enters the city shouting, and the entire city of Shiloh rises up with a tremendous cry. Eli was sitting on his chair beside the road, waiting for news of the battle. The text gives us specific details about the old man. He was 98 years old. His eyes were already without sight. He could not see. He was heavy. The Hebrew terms suggest severe obesity. And his heart, the text says, trembled for the ark. Notice carefully, not for his sons, for the ark. The messenger arrives before him. Eli, unable to see but hearing the tumult, asks, "What has happened, my son?" And the messenger replies, in a sequence that seems carefully designed by the biblical author to measure exactly the heart of Eli. First, he says, "I am the one who came from the battle." Second, "I fled from the battle today." Third, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people. Fourth, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead. Fifth, the Ark of God has been captured. And here something happens that should shake you. Eli hears the defeat. He hears the slaughter of 30,000 men. He hears the death of his two sons. And he does not move. He stays seated. He keeps processing. But when the messenger says the Ark of God has been captured, when he pronounces those words, Eli fell off his chair backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. He fell backward, his neck broke, He died instantly, and notice how the biblical text interprets his death. It does not say he died from the news of his sons. It explicitly says he died from the combined weight of his advanced age and from the news of the captured ark. Even in death, Eli showed what had always been his interior hierarchy. The ark mattered to him more than his sons, and that, in a certain sense, was theologically correct. But it was too late. The man who could not rebuke his sons for God in life dies for God at the last news he hears, a double tragedy. Think about this. Eli had reached the end of an entire life of ministry, 40 years as judge and high priest, 40 years at the head of the tabernacle, 40 years teaching the law, pronouncing blessings, offering incense. And the balance of those 40 years was this scene: a blind, obese old man falling off a chair beside the gate with a broken neck, dying from a piece of news, and one final detail was still missing. The detail that gives a name to this entire event. The wife of Phinehas, the younger son of Eli, was pregnant, at full term. In Shiloh, at the very moment the news arrives, the woman goes into premature labor. The pains tear through her. The text says that the midwives try to encourage her, "Do not be afraid, for you have given birth to a son." It is what she most desired in life, a male, an heir to the priestly line. But she does not respond. She does not respond because she is already dying. She is bleeding out in childbirth. Her eyes search for something that no midwife can give her. Her newborn son is crying beside her, and she, in the last seconds of life she has left, pronounces words that will be engraved in the book of books forever. Ichabod, the glory has departed from Israel. Ichabod. In Hebrew, Icabod. The prefix I is a negation, no without, where. And kavod is glory, weight, honor, the tangible presence of God. Ichabod literally means no glory, or in a more poetic reading, where is the glory? That was the last word of that woman. That was the name she left for her son. And that was the theological diagnosis of everything that had happened. The glory has departed from Israel, she said, because the ark of God has been captured and because of the death of her father-in-law and her husband. And in that exact order. First the ark, then the father-in-law, then the husband. The woman, like her father-in-law, understood the true hierarchy of the loss. The glory had gone. For 350 years, since the days of Moses, the cloud of the glory of God had rested upon the tabernacle of Shiloh. That glory had guided Israel in the wilderness. That glory had terrified the pagan peoples. That glory had been the absolute distinguishing mark of the chosen people. And that day, in a battlefield, by the accumulated sin of 2 corrupt priests and a cowardly father, the glory left. The tabernacle of Shiloh never returned to what it had been, and archaeology confirms this story with surprising precision. The first excavations of the site were conducted by Danish teams between the years 1926 and 1932. Later, in the 1980s, the Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University identified a layer of massive fire destruction at the site. And from the year 2017 until the present day, the excavations continue under the direction of Scott Stripling on behalf of the Associates for Biblical Research. The Stripling team has confirmed, through ceramic and carbon-14 dating, a layer of destruction by fire dated with precision to the year 1075 before Christ, exactly compatible with the Battle of Ebenezer narrated in 1 Samuel 4. They found calcined stones, a demolished 4-horned altar, ceramic pomegranates used in worship, burned storehouses, the physical fingerprint of the judgment. The Philistines, after their victory, probably razed Shiloh. The tabernacle was destroyed, and although it would later be rebuilt in other places, in Nob, in Gibeon, it never again housed the ark. The ark, after its Philistine wandering and after finally returning to Israel, would go to Kiriath-Jearim, then to the house of Obed-Edom, and finally, by David, to Jerusalem. But Shiloh was finished. The prophet Jeremiah, 600 years later, was still using the fall of Shiloh as a warning. In his prophecies, God says to the people, "Go now to my place that was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it because of the evil of my people Israel." See what I did to it. That archaeological ruin, that silent hill in Ephraim, was still 6 centuries later a physical sermon, a monument to divine judgment, a permanent reminder that God can take away his glory. The pilgrims who went up to Jerusalem sometimes passed by that place and saw the calcined stones, the toppled columns, the ground covered with weeds. And in that devastation, they heard echoes of Hophni and Phinehas. They heard echoes of the women raped at the entrance. They heard echoes of Eli falling off the chair. They heard echoes of a woman giving birth and dying and leaving as her last gift the name Ichabod. But behind all this judgment, there was something more. Something the superficial reader of the Old Testament can miss. The question that should arise within you, if you have come this far, is this: why did God let this happen? Why did he not intervene before? Why did he not kill Hophni and Phinehas the very first day they raped a woman of the sanctuary? The answer is hidden in the prayer of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, a prayer that many scholars consider a messianic prophecy. Hannah declares, among other things, "The Lord kills and he gives life. He brings down to Sheol and he raises up. The Lord makes poor and he makes rich. He humbles and he exalts." The prayer ends with words directed to the anointed king of the Lord, words that, at the moment Hannah pronounces them, have no historical referent yet, because Israel has no king. God was preparing a change of era. The corruption of the priesthood of Eli was not a flaw in the divine system. It was part of a greater plan. God was going to use the catastrophe of Shiloh to do 3 things. First, he was going to transfer the focus of Israel from the sanctuary to the prophecy, because immediately after the destruction of Shiloh, Samuel emerges as the first great prophet since Moses. Second, he was going to prepare the way for the monarchy, because without Shiloh as center, Israel would long for a political stability that would culminate in the request for a king, first Saul, then David. Third, and most importantly, he was going to prefigure a theological reality that would only be completed 1,000 years later. No human priesthood can sustain the glory of God indefinitely. The entire letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament develops exactly this point. The Levitical priesthood was provisional, it was weak, it was full of sinful men like Hophni and Phinehas who could contaminate the entire system. That is why God promised, since the days of Psalm 110, a priest of another order, the order of Melchizedek, a sinless priest, an eternal priest, a priest who does not need to offer sacrifices for himself, because he himself is the sacrifice, Christ. The glory that left Shiloh would return 1,000 years later in flesh. John writes in Greek with theological precision, "Kai ho logos sarx egeneto kai eskenosen en hemin," and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word eskenosen comes from skene, tent, tabernacle. John is saying literally that Jesus tabernacled among us. The tabernacle destroyed in Shiloh was rebuilt in the flesh of the Messiah, and this time the glory would not leave. But all of that was future when that woman dying in Shiloh pronounced the word Ichabod. At that moment, Israel knew nothing of the Messiah. Israel only knew that the glory had left, that the ark was in Philistine hands, that the priests were dead, that Eli was dead, that the tabernacle was probably in flames, that 30,000 men had fallen, that something fundamental had been broken in the covenant, and all of this ruin had begun with two men who believed themselves above the law, two priests who thought that the sacred uniform protected them from consequences, two sons of Belial who confused access to the sanctuary with ownership of the sanctuary. Two men who, when the prophet announced their death, did not repent. Two men who, when their father spoke to them, did not listen, because the Lord had already desired to put them to death. There is a final lesson that the biblical text never says explicitly, but that runs through the whole story like a dark vein. God does not kill just anyone. God does not destroy just any ministry. But there is a point, a specific point, at which divine patience ends. Hophni and Phinehas had years. They had Eli telling them to stop. They had the people murmuring in their ears. They had the man of God pronouncing the sentence. They had the boy Samuel growing in the sanctuary, being the object of the divine revelation that they themselves had lost. And they listened to nothing. And when a priest no longer listens to any voice of warning, the only one who can speak is God himself. And God spoke that day at Aphek with Philistine swords. If you are still here with me, hit that like button right now. This channel exists to tell the biblical stories that no one dares to touch, the ones others avoid, the ones that deserve to be known with the depth they have. Your support with that blue button, with that simple gesture, is what makes it possible for these truths to keep reaching more people. Drop a like if you are following the story. So ends the narrative of Shiloh. So is fulfilled the prophecy. So paid two men who believed themselves untouchable for belonging to the priesthood of Aaron. But there is one last suspended question, a question that Jeremiah asked 600 years later, looking at the ruins of Shiloh, a question that Ezekiel asked when he saw the glory abandon the second temple, a question that the disciples asked when they saw the veil of the temple torn from top to bottom on the day Christ died, a question that still runs through every church that believes itself immune to the judgment of God. Where is the glory? The widow of Phinehas gave the name to her son, Ichabod, without glory. That child would grow up in an Israel without a functional tabernacle, without a central ark, without a respected priesthood. He would grow up watching his uncle Ahitub become priest, and then his cousin Ahijah, and then Ahimelech, and then Abiathar. The entire line of Eli walking toward the slow extinction the man of God had prophesied. Generation after generation, men of the house of Eli dying young, the priesthood weakening, until Solomon, 3 generations later, definitively cut off the line. And that boy, Ichabod, would grow up carrying in his name every time someone called him, the reminder of what the nation had lost the day he was born. Imagine being Ichabod. Imagine being the boy whose name means without glory. Imagine having to introduce yourself to strangers. Hello, my name is Ichabod, and watching the eyes of all of them grow sad at hearing the name. Living with the memory of the collapse carried in your identity, being yourself a walking monument to the loss. It all began with a 3-pronged fork thrust into a pot before its time. It all began with 2 women seduced at a sacred door. It all began with a father who chose silence. It all began with 2 men who thought the priestly uniform made them owners of what was sacred. And it all ended with the word that a dying woman left, engraved in the name of a child. Ichabod. Where is the glory?